tremendous honor for me to be here. I'm really quite in awe of many of you who've come to gather at this conference. And as Jay mentioned, I spend my time in courtrooms, I spend my time in jails, I spend my time in prisons. My clients are the poor. My clients are people who've been condemned. My clients are people who live in the margins of our society. And even though I advocate for people who are often quite hated, quite feared, I think there's something quite powerful when we understand why we do the things we do. And that's sort of what I want to talk about, why we do the things we do. I'm someone who believes deeply in the power of identity. I think when we commit ourselves to doing something, to saying something, our words have much more meaning, much more power, much more influence when they're wrapped behind some identity. I think if you're a teacher, you can do some good things, but if you're a caring teacher, you can do some great things. I think if you're a doctor, you can do some amazing things, but if you're a compassionate doctor, you can do some extraordinary things. And this power that resides in identity, I think is frequently underestimated. I don't think we often think about who we are in relation to the problems we're trying to solve, who we are in relation to the community where we live, who we are in relation to the issues that we care about. And I learned about identity not from the work that I do, not when I was a student. I actually learned about identity in my home growing up with my grandmother. My grandmother was this classic African-American matriarch. She was the dominant force in our family. She was tough, she was strong, but she was also loving. She was the end of every argument in our household. She was also the beginning of a lot of arguments in our household. But she had this quality about her that whenever I would see her, she'd come up to me and she'd give me these hugs. And she'd squeeze me so tightly, and then she'd look down at me. And when I saw her an hour or two later, she'd look at me and she'd say, "Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?" And if I said no, she'd assault me again, and if I'd say yes, she'd kind of leave me alone. And she had this quality that you always wanted to be near her. My grandmother was the daughter of people who were enslaved. Her parents were born in Virginia in slavery in the 1840s. She was born in the 1880s, and the experience of slavery very much shaped the way she saw the world. And she had this way about her that you always wanted to spend time. The difficulty was that she had 10 children. My mom was the youngest of her 10 kids. And whenever I would spend time with her, I'd have to compete with my cousins for her time and attention. And I remember when I was about 9 years of age, going to my grandmother's house, and my cousins were running all around. And I woke up one morning, and I went into the living room, and I sat down, and my grandmother was staring at me. And from across the room, I thought we were first playing a game, but she just had this serious look, and I would look away, and she'd still be staring. And finally, after about 20 minutes of this, she got up, and she came over to me, and she said, "Come on, Bryan, you and I are going to have a talk." And I remember this just like it happened yesterday. She took me out back, and she said, "Now, don't tell anybody what I tell you." I said, "Okay, Mama, I won't tell anybody." And she sat me down, and she looked at me very seriously, and she said, "Bryan, I want you to know that I've been watching you." And she said, "I think you're special." She said, "I think you can do anything you want to do." And I remember looking up at her as she said these things, and she said, "I just need you to promise me 3 things. I said, "Okay, Mama." She said, "The first thing I want you to promise me is that you'll always love your mom, no matter what happens." She said, "That's my baby girl, and you have to promise me now you'll always love her, you'll always take care of her." Well, I adored my mom, so I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." And then I remember her saying to me, "The second thing I want you to promise me is that you'll always do the right thing, even when the right thing is the hard thing." And I thought about it, and I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." And then she said, "The last thing I want you to promise me is that you'll never drink alcohol." Well, I was 9 years old, so I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." I grew up in the country, and I have a brother a year older than me and a sister a year younger, and when I was about 14 or 15, one day my brother came home, and he'd gotten this beer somewhere, and we went back out in the woods, and my brother opened up the beer bottle, and he had some, and he gave it to my sister, and she had some, and they offered it to me, and I was hesitating. And my brother said, "Come on, have some beer. We're having beer today. Try some beer." I said, No, I'm not going to do that. Y'all go ahead." And my brother said, "Come on, no, we're having beer today. I had some, your sister had some, you have some too." I said, no, that's okay. I'm not going to do that. And then my brother started staring at me, and he looked at me real hard, and he said, "I hope you're not still hung up on that conversation Mama had with you." I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "Well, Mama tells all the grandkids that they're special." I was devastated. And I'm going to probably admit something I shouldn't admit. I'm going to tell you that I'm 52 years old and that I've never had a drop of alcohol. And I don't say that because I think there's something virtuous about that. I say that because there really is power in identity. We can sometimes say things to people to get them to see the world in ways that they wouldn't say it otherwise. We can sometimes get people to do things that they don't think they can do. We can sometimes get people to imagine a future that they can't otherwise imagine. When I thought about what my grandmother said to me, of course she would think all of her grandchildren were special. My grandfather was in prison during Prohibition. I had male uncles who died from alcohol abuse, and these were the things that she felt like we needed to commit to, and because of that, I haven't been able to let go of it. There's something about her identity that I cannot shake. Well, I've been trying to say things during the course of my career about this country. I've been trying to say things about how radically America has changed in the last 40 years through our use of mass incarceration, because we've been infected, in my opinion, by the politics of fear and anger. In 1972, there were 300,000 people in jails and prisons. Today, there are 2.3 million. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We have over 6 million people on probation and parole. In communities like Washington, D.C., and urban communities across this country, you can go into parts of many low-income areas where 60% of the young men of color are in jail, in prison, on probation, or parole. Nationwide, 1 out of 3 black men is in jail, prison, probation, or parole. These horrific collateral consequences, and there is this profound absence of hope that I think has begun to shape the way we see each other. There are now 44 million people living below the poverty level. And how we think about them and how we see them is shaped by, I think, some of these dynamics. I've been trying to talk to people about why I think it's wrong to give in to fear and anger, why it's wrong to think that we can throw people away, why it's wrong to think that mass incarceration is a way forward. And I say it not just because I think that it's a policy decision that may not make sense. I say it because I think there's something fundamentally at risk about our identity. Our criminal justice system, like many systems across our country, is very wealth sensitive. We have a system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. Wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes. And because of that, I'm concerned that we're not really living up to our commitment to be a just society, a fair society, a society that's committed to equality. I look at the way we sometimes punish people. I do a lot of work representing people on death row. And the issue of the death penalty sometimes kind of gets turned around. In our country, we ask the question, do people deserve to die for the crime that they've committed? When to me, I think the real question is, do we deserve to kill? When we have a system that's been so compromised by our inability to meet the needs of the poor. The death penalty in America is defined by error. For every 9 people that we've executed, we've actually identified 1 innocent person on death row who's been exonerated. In my state of Alabama, just this week, someone was released after spending 18 years on death row. And this problem of error might, in any other rational system, cause us to pause, cause us to step back, but we persist. I think about that in other contexts. In the aviation area, if for every 9 planes that took off, 1 crashed, would we really allow people to continue flying? I don't think we would, but yet in this area we persist. We persist. I think about these issues because I think about the identity that's behind them. As Jay mentioned, a couple of weeks ago, I was arguing before the United States Supreme Court that we should stop sentencing children to die in prison. The United States is the only country in the world where 13 and 14-year-old children can be sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Hundreds of these kids have been sentenced to die in prison. The race disparities are quite disturbing. And yet there is this silence. In my state, we permanently disenfranchise people who have criminal convictions, and this problem of disenfranchisement is growing. 35% of the black men in the state of Alabama have permanently lost the right to vote. In many jurisdictions, we're predicting that in the next 10 years, we could actually be looking at a level of disenfranchisement in many parts of this country that is higher than when the Voting Rights Act was passed in the 1960s. Why is that? Well, I think healthy communities have to sometimes pay attention to their history. They have to look at that history and appreciate what that history represents. And in my communities, in the communities where I work, there is this burden that you encounter when you talk to older people who reflect on these histories. People of color who grew up with terrorism, who grew up with lynching, who worried about being the victims of racial violence, who worried about being bombed, who worried about all of the humiliation they might encounter when they went to town, all of the segregation laws, all of the Jim Crow laws. They worry about all of those things. In fact, they tell me all the time, they say, Mr. Stevenson, you go out and you give these talks, make people stop saying that we're dealing with terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They say, we grew up with terrorism. We had to worry about being bombed. We had to worry about being lynched. Make them stop saying that. That era of terror was, of course, followed by Jim Crow, segregation. I'm a product of the Civil Rights Movement. I'm a product of Brown versus Board of Education. When I started my education, I couldn't go to the public school. I had to go to the colored school. And I remember when lawyers and people came into our community and opened up the public schools for me, and but for that witness, but for the identity behind that activism, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you tonight. And so it matters to me that we struggle over identity, that we struggle with our history, that we not be ashamed to look at that history with some humility, that we not think about the things we've done and learn from them. I gave some lectures in Germany not too long ago. It was fascinating. I was talking about race and the death penalty. And at the end of these lectures, one of the scholars there got up and said, well, we don't talk about this very often in this country, but I'm going to just make a statement that I think most of the people in the room will agree with. And she started talking about how in Germany they can never have the death penalty again. And she said, we understand our obligation to our history requires us to never engage in the systematic killing of human beings. And she started talking about it in this way that made the whole room very quiet. And I started thinking about that on my flight back home. I started thinking, yes, how would it feel if we lived in a world where the nation-state of Germany was still executing people? And how would it feel if the people they were executing were disproportionately Jewish? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized it would be unconscionable. It would be vastly unacceptable for me to live in such a world. I'd have to say something. I'd have to do something. And then I got off the plane in Alabama, and I went through the states of the Old South, and I went to death row where there's this disproportionately high percentage of people of color, and I went to the places where people are buried in the ground after being lynched. I went to the places where I saw older people humiliated as a child as a result of Jim Crow laws. I went to the places where the white and colored signs used to be. I went to the places where people are still moving in the margins of our society with this burden of discrimination and bias sitting on top of them. Well, why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because I believe that we have the capacity for great things in our country. We have the capacity to create new innovative solutions to some of the most vexing problems. We have the capacity to do amazing things with our technology, extraordinary things with our creativity and our ability to entertain, dazzling things with our capacity for design. But I'm here to suggest that we will not be judged by our technology, by our entertainment, by our design, by our innovation. I'm here to suggest that ultimately we are going to be judged by those things lurking in the shadow, by our willingness to confront suffering, by our willingness to confront poverty, by our willingness to confront inequality and injustice. Because it's ultimately there that we understand what it means to be truly human. It's there that we reveal our identity. It's fascinating when you think about it, because it'd be so much easier if we could just kind of close the room and close the door and put out the things that are so vexing and difficult. But in many ways, I believe our challenge as a healthy community, as people who are alive to the mission of life, requires us to not do the things that are easy. I think sometimes you have to stand when everybody else is sitting. I think sometimes you have to say something when everybody else is quiet. And when you do that, yes, you are burdened by all of the challenges, but you are liberated by the possibilities of creating an identity that resonates in an honest way. Now, I will warn you that if you do that, you will get overwhelmed. It's much simpler to not talk about the things that make us uncomfortable and inconvenient. Much simpler. I had the great privilege when I was a young lawyer of meeting Rosa Parks. The mother of the civil rights movement. She would come back to Montgomery from time to time, and every now and then She'd get together with her two closest friends in Montgomery, Johnny Carr, who was the organizer of the Montgomery bus boycott, Virginia Durr, who was a close friend of her, a white woman whose husband, Clifford Durr, represented Dr. King. And these women would get together and just sit and talk. And every now and then, Miss Carr would call me when Miss Parks came to town, and she'd say, Bryan, Miss Parks is coming to town, and we're going to get together and talk. Do you want to come over and listen? And I'd say, yes, ma'am, I do. And then she'd ask me, what does the word listen mean, Bryan? And I'd say, that means I don't say a word. She'd say, okay, well, you can come. And I would go over there, I'd listen to these women talk, and it would be so inspiring. I'd be so energized just listening to them. And one day I was over there after listening to them talk for a couple of hours, and Miss Parks turned to me and she said, now, Bryan, tell me what the Equal Justice Initiative is. Tell me what you're trying to do. And I looked at Ms. Carr, and I got permission to speak, and she gave me the nod, and so I said, well, we're trying to do something about mass incarceration. We're trying to do something about the poor. We're trying to do something about people who are suffering. We're trying to do something about people who've been condemned. We're trying to do something about these children in the adult system. We're trying to do something about poverty and racial bias. I gave her my whole rap, and when I finished, she looked at me, and she said, She said, that's going to make you tired. And that's when Ms. Carr leaned forward and she put her finger in my face and she said, that's why you've got to be brave. I'm here because I want us to consider being more courageous, being braver about the things that are oftentimes ignored, to be willing to talk about suffering, to be willing to talk about inequality, to be willing to talk about poverty and injustice. Because in that dynamic, there is something quite powerful. I believe very simple things. I believe that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. My clients have taught me that. I've been taught by my clients that if someone tells a lie, they're not just a liar. If you take something that doesn't belong to you, you're not just a thief. Even if you kill somebody, you're not just a killer. And because of that, there's this basic human dignity that can never be exempted from our best healthcare practices, from our best orientation to respecting human rights and dignity. I also believe that in this country and in many parts of this globe, that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. I think we get confused by that. I think in too many places in our world, the opposite of poverty is not wealth, but justice. And if we're really going to do something to create the kind of identity that I think most of us appreciate and embrace, we've got to think in more just ways about our communities and our worlds and our missions. And finally, I believe that we will ultimately, as TEDMED, as a community of people who care, as a community of people who are curious, not be judged by how we treat the privileged, how we treat the powerful, how we treat those who are celebrated and gifted. I believe we will ultimately be judged by how we treat the poor, the condemned, the incarcerated. Sometimes thinking like this can get you disoriented. I don't like it. A lot of times I wish kind of my grandmother hadn't suggested to me that identity was so important. It'd be a lot more convenient. And sometimes I even get out of balance and I make these mistakes, and I've made these mistakes in the past. I've been working on these cases involving children tried as an adult, and I don't understand how a judge actually gets this power to turn a child into an adult. Young kids, 8, 9, 10 years of age, being tried as adults. When I go back to the jail and I see these young kids, I don't understand how they got that status. And I was up late one night, I hadn't slept very much, and I was just not thinking straight. And I started having this conversation with myself, which was a kind of crazy conversation where I was saying, well, you know, Bryan, if the judge can change a child into an adult, the judge must have magic power. The judge must have the ability to do things that you need the judge to do for you. I said, yeah, Bryan, that's true. You should pursue that. And I started thinking about this, and I started working on this crazy motion. And the motion was titled, Motion to Try My Poor Black Male Client, 14-year-old client, like a privileged white corporate executive. And I put in my motion all the reasons why I wanted him to have that identity rather than this identity. And there was language in the motion about misconduct, police misconduct, and prosecutorial misconduct, and judicial misconduct. I think there was a line in there about how there's no conduct in this county, it's all misconduct. And the next morning I woke up and I thought, now did I write that crazy motion or did I dream that? And to my horror, I looked in the case file, and not only had I written the motion, but I'd sent it to court. About a month later, it was time to go to court, and I opened up the case file, and I thought to myself, oh my God, this is that crazy case where I wrote that insane motion. And I got in my car, and I drove down to this courthouse to argue these motions, and when I got there, I just knew it was going to be awful, ugly and awful. And I was sitting there in my car, and I was just thinking, I'm so tired. This is so exhausting. And finally, I got my act together, and I got my briefcase, and I walked up the front steps of the courthouse, and when I got to the top of the steps, there was this older black man who was the janitor. And when this man saw me coming up the steps, he came over to me, and he said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm a lawyer." He said, "You're a lawyer?" I said, "Yes, sir, I am." And this man came over to me, and he hugged me, and he whispered in my ear, he said, "I'm so proud of you." And when he did that, it was just energizing. His hug made me think of my grandmother. And when he let go, I just felt differently. And I went into the courtroom. As soon as I walked in, the judge was already on the bench. He said, "Mr. Stevenson, did you write this crazy motion?" I said, "Yes, sir, I did." And we started talking about poverty, and we started talking about race, and we started talking about the needs of people who are outside of our systems of thinking, outside our systems of care. We started talking about why it's necessary to think about all of us if we're going to do something that advances humanity. And out of the corner of my eye, I could see this janitor pacing outside the door, and people were coming inside the courtroom who were angry that we were talking about race and poverty and all of these difficult issues. And before I knew it, the courtroom was packed filled with people that were all very angry. And finally, this janitor pacing outside the door kept looking through the window. I saw him open the door, walk into the courtroom, and he sat down behind me. About 10 minutes later, the judge said we'd take a break, and during the break, there was a deputy sheriff who was offended that the janitor had come into court. And when the break took place, the deputy jumped up and he ran over to this janitor, and he went over to him and he said, "Jimmy, what are you doing in this courtroom?" And this older black man stood up and he looked at me, and he looked at that deputy sheriff. He said, "I came into this courtroom to tell this young man, keep your eyes on the prize and hold on." Well, I'm here this evening because I believe that there are many of us who want more from our community, who want more from our identity, who want more from the world that we create than a world where we ignore suffering, where we ignore poverty, where we ignore inequality. I believe that if we embrace that challenge, yes, we will be tired. Yes, we will be confronted with things that are sometimes difficult, but I also believe that we can find liberation. We can find the kind of identity that allows us to really connect with each other as human beings. Humanity ultimately requires us to respect every person's human dignity. Every person's human dignity. For me, the great challenge of our era is to recognize that even the most complex problems, even the most disadvantaged people, even the most broken and rejected people, even the most vexing healthcare issues, even the most completely devastating aspects of suffering require honest people to stand up with a sense of identity, recognizing that love is their motivation and justice is the instrument. And those people, I hope, that hear that and understand that, those people who recognize that, those people who embrace that, I've just come this evening to tell you to keep your eyes on the prize and hold on. Thank you very much.